Welcome back to part 4 of our series on realism in fantasy RPG combat, where we are going over and then providing commentary on the 2003 essay by John Clements on the subject. In this video, we're going to be talking about combat skill. Number 4, combat skill. John writes, "A warrior has fighting skill, a non-warrior does not. Once a person learns about how to fight in general and how to use a weapon, regardless of whether or not they have high skill with any particular weapons, they nonetheless know and understand the vital principles and concepts of combat. They have a higher sense of distance, timing, technique, and perception, as well as the necessary martial attitude. This, presumably along with physical conditioning, is what defines them as a fighting character. Non-warriors don't work this way. So virtually any weapon, from a chair to a sickle, can be employed by a warrior without their training with it first. They may not have the expertise or mastery of that particular weapon, but whatever it is, they can certainly pick it up and reasonably defend themselves using it. Fighting skill is not an issue of just physical aptitude then, but neuromuscular preparation, i.e. training in understanding core principles. Looks like the same applies if caught unarmed. Identical concepts applied between weapons and unarmed fighting, even if the warrior doesn't have the specific training in the unarmed techniques. Skill is what determines whether or not you can hit or be hit in melee. When it comes to using weapons, you really only have expertise and mastery, say +1 and +2 for instance, and everything else is just know-how. But if you aren't a warrior and have a sedentary non-physical nature, then you certainly would be unskilled in fighting, and get, for example, a -1 to -2 on any weapon used. The bottom line is there is general combat skill, and then there is weapon-specific skill. The two are distinct but interrelated. I do think about this quite a bit, because if somebody is really good at killing you with a short sword, and then you hand the person a longer sword, or you hand the person a mace, they are still going to be really good at killing you. So I think there is a lot to be said for a combat skill. Now, of course, this runs counter to something like GURPS, which, like I said, I have been a fan of for years, which has every single different weapon divided down into different skills. Now, of course, they do default to one another, which is another layer of complication. So, becoming good at one does give you a higher default at using another, but you're going into a lot of granular detail about each individual weapon, and then you can get into different techniques from there about parrying or being specifically good at some particular form of attack, and getting increasingly granular. That can certainly appeal to a lot of people, and it did appeal to me for a long time, but it's probably overdone. And so this is something that much simpler, even more narrative-style games do better, because like Fate, for instance, just has like a combat skill and then a shooting skill to handle ranged weapons. And some people won't think that's granular enough, but that's certainly the most dramatic application of this principle. You either know how to fight or you don't, and then there's some degree in knowing how to fight, and then the particulars of what particular weapon you're using isn't really all that determinative in the outcome of the battle. I think a lot of times we use a lot of different combat skills and techniques in games because it's often the combat that a lot of the game revolves around. And so it makes sense that if you're going to be spending a lot of time in the game actually fighting each other, or fighting dragons or other NPCs or orcs or whatever it is that you're doing, if the combat's a big part of that, then it makes sense for there to be a lot of rules, or could make sense for there to be a lot of rules to explain how you might do, this or this other thing a little bit differently. And so you end up with a lot more combat rules than you do for, say, social situations. On the whole, I'm in favor of reducing the number of combat skills far down from something like what GURPS has. Maybe going to the degree of Fate is a bit extreme, but I think that some small number of combat skills is probably what you want. Then, rather than distinguishing between the fighter who is really good at using the mace versus really good at using the short sword, well, then you could perhaps distinguish using a crushing weapon or a cutting weapon against the particular armor that the opponent's wearing. Simplifying in one frees up more cognitive space and time at the gaming table to focus on something else. So if I were playing GURPS today, for instance, I would probably aggregate weapon skills or use bang or wildcard skills, as they're called, in order to group together fighting skills. It occurs to me that when he's talking about expertise or mastery in one particular weapon, sure, we could certainly have a character who is particularly deadly with a particular kind of sword, like some kind of sword master that uses some kind of culturally specific sword. In a game like Fate, using an aspect for expertise in that weapon, or mastery, or maybe a stunt or something like that to represent those, would probably take care of what you need. Now let's look at some games. We could go and look at Fate and also the massive lists of weapon skills in GURPS, but I think we've already covered everything there that's relevant to the point at hand. But it did occur to me that 5th edition D&D basically doesn't have a combat skill. A 5th edition attack is pretty simple. The rules say you roll a d20 and then add your strength or dexterity ability modifier, if the attack is a melee attack or a ranged attack, respectively. Simple. Everyone, no matter what their class, rolls a d20 and then adds either their strength or dexterity modifiers. Both fighters and wizards fight in exactly the same way, the only difference there being what the individual character's modifiers are, which, as I've said before, is probably only really the difference between a +1 and a +3, or maybe a +4 for any individual characters, so it's not much of a variation anyway. Oh, and then the character also gets to add his or her proficiency bonus when attacking with a weapon that he or she is proficient in. 5th edition has weapons split into rather broad categories like simple and martial weapons. The game just tells you which of these groups your class is proficient in. So there you get some difference, because the fighter and the wizard both using swords would not be equally as good, because the fighter can add his or her proficiency bonus to the attack roll with the sword, and the wizard cannot. For everything D&D is, that's pretty simple. This idea of everyone fighting the same goes all the way back to when Thaco was a thing. Here's an example from AD&D. Many people will be surprised to learn that level 1 characters had exactly the same chance to hit something in combat back then. In fact, I was looking at the AD&D book, and Thaco at any particular level for a character was not even in the section on the character classes. It's in the combat section on calculating Thaco, and here is the table. So this is basically the combat skill per category of PCs. Each one of the character classes fits into one of these categories. For instance, fighters are in the warrior category. Warriors didn't actually start off any better than wizards at fighting, it was just that fighters got better much more quickly. Thaco means to hit armor class 0, so a Thaco of 20 is the worst. You'd have to roll a 20 in order to hit an armor class 0 character. Lower Thacos are better. Kinda crazy, isn't it? But that's basically the combat skill. Thaco is how well you fight. But then it got complicated a little bit with weapon proficiencies, and unfortunately, weapon proficiencies were weapon-specific and not for a whole group or kind of weapon. That seems to be a negative. If you were not proficient in the weapon you were fighting with, you had to take a penalty, and the penalty for being non-proficient was different for different classes. It was least for fighters, since they were the ones who were supposed to have received the most cross-training between different kinds of weapons. However, AD&D does have this reference to weapon groups, but curiously it only gives some suggestions for them and leaves the weapon groupings themselves rather free-form for the DM. A character who is proficient with a weapon in the group is supposed to be familiar with all the other weapons in the group and will only have half of the character's non-proficiency penalty applied if they try to attack with it. Probably, if I'm going to go simple with things, then I would make the weapon categories the things you get proficiency in. Then there's just the penalty for non-proficiency. That's the direction that 5th edition moved with very broad categories. Although in that case there's no penalty for being non-proficient, it's just that you don't get to add a bonus. Then from there, AD&D had weapon specialization, but only for fighters. If a fighter expended another proficiency slot on a single weapon, they would get +1 to hit and +2 damage with it if it was a melee weapon. But it notes that weapon specialization is an optional rule anyway. So if you were looking at a game and had weapon proficiency based on weapon groups, then you could still have specialization for a single weapon, and I like that. You could go even deeper if you had AD&D Combat and Tactics, because that had not only specialization, but also weapon mastery, with the levels Mastery, High Mastery, and then Grand Mastery levels, if you thought that you needed to go even further and deeper into weapon specialization. But depending on the granularity of the game, you might not need that anyway, and weapon mastery was supposed to be very rare anyway. So surprisingly, AD&D appears to be a model here for something like this kind of weapon skill. For now, I like keeping things simple. Maybe a game could go with something like a fighting skill, proficiency in weapon groups, and then specialization in individual weapons. Okay, I think that's just about enough on this subject for now. If you've enjoyed it, please go back to my channel. There's a whole bunch of other videos to watch. And in the next video, we will take a look at the subject of initiative and choice for fantasy combat RPGs. See you then.